Gran Colombia. 1819 to 1830, the Constitution of Cúcuta. Bolívar and Santander, regional conflict. The Ocana Convention. The night of September 25th, the disintegration of Union, presented by Professor Franklin Booton Soto. The victory at Boyaca in August of 1819 did not end the political crisis of northern South America. It solved one problem and created another. Spanish military authority in central Nueva Granada had been broken, but the larger question remained unresolved. What kind of state would replace empire, and who would govern it? The answer attempted by the Patriot leadership was the creation of a large republic joining Venezuela and Nueva Granada, later expanded by the incorporation of Quito. This state became known as Gran Colombia. It existed formally from 1819 to 1830, and for a brief moment it appeared to many contemporaries as the most ambitious republican experiment in Spanish America. Yet from its beginning, Gran Colombia carried internal contradictions. It joined regions with different economies, military traditions, elite networks, local grievances, and political expectations. It was built during wartime, administered across immense distances, and held together in large part by the prestige of one man, Simón Bolívar. Before discussing the new republic, it is necessary to understand the political trauma that preceded it. Between 1810 and the Reconquest years, the early Patriot movement saw repeated turnover in executive leadership. Presidents, governors, triumvirs, and provincial chiefs were displaced by coups, factional disputes, battlefield defeat, exile, or execution. Among those who fell before the decisive Patriot recovery were Jorge Tadeo Lozano, Camilo Torres Tenorio, Manuel Rodriguez Torres, Custodio Garcia Rovira, and Liborio Mejia. The repeated destruction of civilian leadership had lasting effects. It elevated military authority, weakened confidence in deliberative politics, and taught a generation of survivors that constitutions without armies were fragile instruments. Young men such as Tomás Cipriano de Mascara matured in that atmosphere. The Congress of Cúcuta met in 1821 to give legal structure to the new republic. Delegates gathered in the city of Villa del Rosario de Cúcuta and produced what became known as the Constitution of Cúcuta. This constitution was important for several reasons. First, it formally created the Republic of Colombia, later called Gran Colombia by historians. Second, it established a centralized republican framework rather than a loose confederation. Third, it created executive, legislative, and judicial branches. Fourth, it attempted to reconcile wartime necessity with constitutional legality. Fifth, it provided international legitimacy at a moment when recognition mattered greatly. The Constitution named Bolívar president and Francisco de Paula Santander vice president. Because Bolívar continued military campaigns in the south, Santander exercised substantial governing authority in Bogota. The Constitution also embraced gradual abolition measures, citizenship concepts, fiscal authority, and administrative uniformity. Yet many local elites immediately feared excessive centralization. Colombia has had numerous constitutions or constitutional charters since independence, depending on how one counts reforms, federal constitutions, and transitional texts. Major national constitutions include those of 1821, 1830, 1832, 1843, 1853, 1858, 1863, 1886, and the current Constitution of 1991. This repeated constitutional replacement reflects a recurring national pattern. Political conflict was often fought not only with armies, but through refounding legal texts. To understand Gran Colombia, one must understand the contrast between Bolívar and Santander. Bolívar was aristocratic in bearing, intellectually ambitious, emotionally intense, personally brave, impatient with mediocrity, and deeply conscious of historical destiny. He could be charming, generous, theatrical, vindictive, affectionate, and severe, sometimes in close succession. He inspired devotion in many followers because he radiated certainty under conditions of uncertainty. Santander was more restrained, methodical, legalistic, disciplined, administratively gifted, and often cooler in personal style. He valued procedure, documentation, and regular institutions. Where Bolívar often thought in continental scale, Santander frequently thought in terms of sustainable governance. This contrast was genuine, though later political memory exaggerated it into caricature. Bolivar was not merely a dreamer, nor Santander merely a clerk. Both were sophisticated political actors. Bolivar's letters reveal both grandeur and anxiety. In the Jamaica letter of 1815, he wrote that Spanish America was a small human race struggling to define itself. In later correspondence, he repeatedly warned that anarchy could destroy independence more effectively than Spain. His famous statement, "He who serves a revolution plows the sea," was written near the end of his life, expressing bitter frustration that sacrifice had not produced stable gratitude. Santander, by contrast, became associated with the phrase "arms have given us independence, laws will give us liberty," whether or not rendered exactly in every later version. The sentiment accurately reflected his political identity. During the early years after 1821, Bolivar's prestige was immense. He was the liberator, victor of Boyaca, Carabobo, and later campaigns in Ecuador and Peru. Cities celebrated him. Legislatures honored him. Portraits circulated. Public ceremonies invoked his name, yet prestige carried burdens. Bolivar was often absent on campaign, leaving subordinates to govern. His supporters expected miracles. His enemies suspected monarchy, personal ambition, or military despotism. As years passed, admiration became more divided. Those who valued unity and military victory continued to revere him, but those who feared centralization increasingly distrusted him. Those burdened by taxes, recruitment, and prolonged war grew impatient. Thus Bolivar's public image evolved from near-universal heroism after major victories to sharply contested authority by the late 1820s. But why did they turn away from Simon Bolivar? Several groups that had once admired Simón Bolívar later distrusted him or grew impatient with his leadership, especially between 1826 and 1830. The reasons were not identical. Some feared dictatorship, others resented taxation, conscription, and prolonged war. Regional leaders objected to central authority from Bogotá. Former allies believed that independence had not produced the orderly republic they expected. Bolívar remained admired by many people, but the broad consensus that followed the great military victories of the early 1820s gradually weakened. Among civilian constitutionalists in New Granada, many supporters of Francisco de Paula Santander believed Bolívar was moving away from republican legality. They respected his military achievements, but feared concentration of power in one man. Santander became associated with the principle, "Arms gave us independence, laws will give us liberty." In Spanish political language of the time, this meant that battlefield triumph alone was insufficient. A republic required regular institutions, functioning courts, and predictable constitutional order. Many jurists and municipal leaders asked privately what purpose the revolution had served if constitutions could be suspended whenever politics became difficult. Distrust also developed in Venezuela, where many officers and regional elites believed Gran Colombia was too centralized. They resented decisions issued from distant Bogotá and argued that Venezuelans had borne enormous military sacrifice during the war. José Antonio Páez became the leading figure of this dissatisfaction during the movement known as La Cosallada in 1826. Páez and his supporters insisted that local realities could not be governed effectively by bureaucratic directives from another region. Bolívar personally intervened and temporarily restored calm, but the underlying grievance remained unresolved. Many Venezuelans still honored Bolívar as liberator while simultaneously rejecting the administrative system associated with him. Another source of concern was Bolívar's constitutional thinking in the later 1820s. When he promoted the Bolivian constitution, critics were alarmed by provisions for a president for life with authority to designate a successor. Bolívar defended strong executive power as necessary in unstable societies emerging from war. He repeatedly warned that anarchy could destroy independence more thoroughly than Spain ever had. Yet opponents saw something closer to monarchy in republican dress. Many liberals asked how the man who had fought kings could now defend life tenure in office. This damaged Bolivar among reformers who had once viewed him as the natural guardian of liberty. Urban and rural populations often expressed impatience in less dramatic ways than politicians did. After years of war, many ordinary inhabitants were exhausted by military requisitions, forced loans, taxes, recruitment demands, and disruption of commerce. They did not always denounce Bolivar in ideological language. Instead, they resisted through tax evasion, desertion, petitions, concealment of property, and local complaints. To families trying to recover from war, the continental campaigns in Peru or Upper Peru could seem distant, while shortages and levies at home were immediate realities. In this sense, disappointment with Bolivar was often practical rather than philosophical. After the failure of the Convention of Ocana in 1828, Bolivar assumed extraordinary powers. To his supporters, this was a necessary emergency measure. To his opponents, it confirmed their worst suspicions. The assassination attempt of September 25, 1828 emerged from this atmosphere. One of the conspirators, Pedro Carujo, became famous for the phrase, "Liberty or death." Whatever the motives of individual conspirators, the language reflected a growing belief among some sectors that Bolivar had changed from defender of liberty into a danger to it. Bolivar himself understood that public sentiment had shifted. His later letters are marked by fatigue, bitterness, and disappointment. One of his most famous statements was, "I have plowed the sea." By this he meant that immense labor had produced no lasting harvest. In another late reflection he wrote, "America is ungovernable for us." These were not the words of a triumphant founder, but of a man who believed faction, ingratitude, and institutional weakness had consumed much of what he had fought to create. Bolivar's changing reputation resulted from the contradictory roles he came to embody. He was at once liberator from Spain, defender of continental unity, centralizer of authority, suspender of constitutions, victorious general, and increasingly isolated ruler. Populations often celebrate the military savior during war and then judge the statesman more harshly in peace. That pattern helps explain why admiration after Boyaca, Carabobo, and Ayacucho did not automatically translate into stable political loyalty by the late 1820s. For younger men such as Tomás Cipriano de Mascara, Bolivar's trajectory offered practical lessons. Military glory could create legitimacy, but legitimacy could erode quickly in civilian politics. National fame did not eliminate regional resentment. Strong authority without institutions generated backlash, yet institutions without force could also fail. Mascara's later career suggests that he studied both Bolivar's greatness and Bolivar's difficulties with close attention. People therefore did not simply turn against Bolivar in one unified movement. Different groups became impatient for different reasons. Liberals feared dictatorship. Regional leaders feared domination. Civilians feared endless burdens. Rivals feared exclusion. Idealists feared betrayal of Republican promises. Bolivar remained revered by many until his death, but by the end of Gran Colombia he was no longer universally trusted. That was one of the central political tragedies of his final years. Regional resentment was one of the republic's deepest structural problems. Venezuelan elites often resented rule from Bogotá. New Granadan civilians sometimes distrusted Venezuelan military officers. Quito possessed its own local priorities and commercial networks. Distances were immense. Roads were poor. Revenues were contested. Patronage appointments became political ammunition. What one region called national necessity, another called domination. A revealing example was the Venezuelan movement known as La Cosayara in 1826, led by José Antonio Páez. Páez resisted central directives and represented Venezuelan regional assertiveness. Bolívar personally intervened to restore temporary calm, but the episode demonstrated that obedience increasingly depended on personal negotiation rather than institutional consensus. Meanwhile, Tomás Cipriano de Mascara advanced during these years. Born into a prominent Popayan family, Mascara entered military service and participated in campaigns of the independence era. He was ambitious, proud, highly conscious of status, and eager for distinction. During military service, he suffered serious battlefield wounds. Contemporary accounts and later biographies describe wounds severe enough to require prolonged treatment and recovery. In one major engagement of the Southern Wars, he was struck and underwent painful surgery typical of the era, performed without modern anesthesia. Recovery from such trauma in the 1820s often meant chronic pain, scarring, intermittent weakness, and psychological hardening rather than sentimental reflection. For Mascara, injury became part of identity. It validated martial honor, enhanced reputation among peers, and reinforced a belief common to his generation, that political authority belonged to men who had physically paid for the Republic. He emerged from recovery more determined, more self-confident, and more conscious that military sacrifice could be converted into political capital. By 1830, he was no longer merely a young officer of good family. He was a seasoned veteran with growing networks and serious future prospects. The Congress of Ocana in 1828 was convened to revise the Constitution of Cucuta. By then, the central question was whether Gran Colombia should remain under the existing centralized framework, move toward federal decentralization, or adopt stronger executive powers. Santander's allies tended to favor constitutional limitation and civilian legality. Bolivar's supporters argued that factional paralysis threatened national survival and that stronger executive authority was necessary. Debates were sharp, procedural maneuvering intense, and compromise elusive. When Bolivar's opponents appeared positioned to limit his program, many of his supporters withdrew. The convention collapsed without settlement. Its failure was decisive. It signaled that constitutional politics could no longer contain the conflict. After Ocana, Bolivar assumed extraordinary powers and governed as dictator in 1828, though the term must be understood in the Roman and 19th century emergency sense, as well as the pejorative modern sense. Supporters viewed it as necessary concentration of authority. Opponents viewed it as betrayal of republican principles. Santander's relationship with Bolivar deteriorated sharply. Former partners had become political rivals. The most dramatic episode followed on the night of September 25, 1828, in Bogota at the Palacio de San Carlos. A group of conspirators entered the palace intending to kill Bolivar. Participants included military officers, civilians, and political opponents linked to anti-dictatorial circles. Among names associated with the plot were Pedro Corujo and other dissidents hostile to Bolivar's emergency regime. The exact chain of command remains debated by historians. Some participants were clearly committed assassins. Others were sympathizers or secondary collaborators. Bolivar was warned in time, most famously through the actions of Manuela Sáenz. She urged or compelled him to flee through a window. He escaped into the night and concealed himself near the San Agustin River area until danger passed. Because of her intervention, later memory honored her as the liberator of the liberator. Several guards and palace defenders were killed. Conspirators were captured, tried, or executed. Others fled. Was Santander involved? This remains one of the most contested questions of Colombian history. Santander denied participation. Evidence showed connections between some conspirators and anti-Bolivarian circles, but direct proof of Santander ordering assassination has long been debated. A military tribunal condemned him to death. Bolivar commuted the sentence to exile. That decision itself reveals uncertainty as well as lingering personal history between the two men. Modern historians generally distinguish between political opposition to Bolivar and proven operational authorship of the assassination plot. Absolute certainty remains elusive. After the attempt, Bolivar's authority survived, but his legitimacy was further damaged. Emergency rule hardened opposition. Regional separatism advanced. Personal fatigue deepened. His correspondence became darker in tone. He wrote repeatedly of ingratitude, faction, and the near impossibility of governing newly independent societies. By 1829 and 1830, Gran Colombia was unraveling. Venezuela moved toward separation. Quito's future diverged. New Granadan factions repositioned themselves for the post-Bolivarian order. Bolivar resigned the presidency in 1830. Ill, exhausted, and politically diminished, he departed Bogota. He died in Santa Marta on December 17, 1830. His final years transformed public perception once again. The feared dictator of opponents became, for many, a tragic founder undone by the very republics he had created. This oscillation between hero, autocrat, savior, and martyr has followed Bolivar's memory ever since. For Masquera and his family, the collapse of Gran Colombia was not abstract constitutional drama. It was a career opportunity and a warning. Opportunity, because older giants were passing from the stage. Warning, because constitutions, reputations, and unions could collapse quickly. Masquera learned from Bolivar the uses of command, symbolism, and audacity. He learned from Santander the importance of administration and law. He learned from the failure of Gran Colombia that regional power bases could outweigh national rhetoric. These lessons would define his later presidencies. Thus, Gran Colombia should not be dismissed merely as a failed union. It was a formative laboratory of Republican government. It created administrative precedents, constitutional debates, military networks, and political myths that shaped Colombia long after the Union dissolved. Its central drama was not simply Bolivar against Santander. It was the unresolved problem of how to convert liberation armies into durable civil states across vast and divided territories. That problem outlived both men. Sources consulted in preparation of this lecture include Archivo General de la Nación de Colombia, Correspondence of Simón Bolívar, Letters of Francisco de Paula Santander, Debates of the Congress of Cucuta and Convention of Ocana, Memoirs of Daniel Florencio O'Leary, José Manuel Restrepo, John Lynch, David Bushnell, Frank Safford, Malcolm Diaz, Biographical Studies of Tomás Cipriano de Masquera and Manuela Sainz.